Still, when the grocery store parking lot had already gone quiet with the particular discomfort of strangers pretending not to notice, a young woman stood beside a battered stroller, tears streaming down her face, saying words she had promised herself she would never say out loud. "Mom said not to beg, but my baby is starving." Nobody walking past in that parking lot yet understood that the man she had just approached, briefcase in hand, halfway to his car, was about to freeze in place because those exact words, spoken in that exact desperate tone, had once belonged to someone else entirely. The young woman's name was Maricela. She was 23 years old, and the baby in the stroller, an 8-month-old girl named Rosalind, was her daughter. Maricela had been managing barely on her own for the past 4 months, ever since the father of her child had left without warning, taking with him what little financial stability their small household had maintained, leaving Maricela to navigate an unforgiving system of unemployment applications, food assistance wait lists, and a part-time job at a laundromat that paid nowhere near enough to cover both rent and formula. Before we go any further, if you believe that asking for help in your most desperate moment takes a particular kind of courage, and that sometimes a stranger's frozen recognition is the beginning of something neither of you expected, please like this video, subscribe to this channel, and share it with someone who needs to believe that vulnerability, however painful, can still lead somewhere unexpectedly good. Now back to the story. The man Maricela approached that afternoon was named Julian Castellan, 46 years old, the founder of a mid-sized logistics consulting firm that had, over the past decade, grown from a single desk in a shared office space into a company employing nearly 200 people. Julian had grown up under circumstances considerably more difficult than his current success suggested, raised primarily by his mother, Esperanza, a woman who had, for several devastating months during Julian's early childhood, found herself in almost the exact position Maricela now occupied, alone, unsupported, and desperate enough to approach strangers in parking lots asking for help feeding her child. Julian had been 4 years old during that period of his family's history, too young to remember most of the specific details, but old enough to carry, somewhere in the deep, wordless part of memory that persists long after conscious recollection fades, the particular cadence of his mother's voice on the worst of those afternoons, the exact, desperate, apologetic tone she used when approaching strangers, always prefaced, he had been told many times in later years by an aunt who witnessed several of those difficult months, with the same phrase Esperanza had drilled into herself as a kind of protective ritual, that she should never simply beg, that she needed instead to explain, clearly and honestly, exactly why she needed help, so that whoever she approached would understand the situation rather than simply dismissing her as another stranger asking for money. Maricela, entirely unaware of any of this history, had developed the exact same protective habit through her own mother's guidance during her own childhood, a nearly identical phrase, passed down through an entirely unrelated family line, born from the same universal instinct that struggling parents across countless different circumstances seem to independently discover: the understanding that specificity and honesty tend to move people more effectively than simple, undifferentiated pleading. That afternoon, Maricela had run out of formula 2 days earlier than her tightly budgeted schedule anticipated, Rosalind's recent growth spurt requiring more frequent feeding than Maricela's careful calculations had accounted for. She had exhausted the local food pantry's monthly allotment already, her part-time paycheck was still 4 days away, and she had made the difficult decision, one she had resisted for months out of pride and fear in equal measure, to approach strangers directly in the grocery store parking lot, hoping someone might be willing to simply purchase a single container of formula for her rather than handing over cash. She worried in the back of her mind might be misused by less honest recipients in situations similar to her own. Julian, walking toward his car after a routine grocery run, had passed dozens of people asking for help over the years, and had developed, like many people navigating busy urban environments, a practiced habit of polite but firm redirection, a habit he was not proud of but had adopted as a necessary boundary against the emotional exhaustion of constant appeals for assistance. He had begun that same practiced redirection with Maricela, offering a brief, sympathetic but ultimately dismissive acknowledgement before continuing toward his car, when her specific words, delivered through genuine, unguarded tears, stopped him entirely. Before we continue, we want to pause here because what happened in Julian's mind during those next several seconds involved a kind of sudden, disorienting recognition that he would later struggle to fully articulate even to people closest to him. The specific phrasing, Mom said not to beg, combined with the exact desperate cadence of Maricella's voice, triggered something in him that felt less like ordinary sympathy and more like an old, half-buried memory, suddenly surfacing with startling clarity. The sound of his own mother's voice, decades earlier, using almost identical words in almost identical circumstances. He stood frozen for several long seconds, briefcase still in hand, staring at Maricela with an expression that she initially misread as disgust or judgment, bracing herself for the same dismissal she had already received from several other strangers that afternoon. Instead, Julian set down his briefcase, knelt slightly to look more directly at Rosalind in her stroller, and asked Maricela, his voice unsteady in a way that surprised even him, how long she had been struggling on her own. What followed was a conversation that unfolded right there in the parking lot, Julian insisting they move to a nearby bench rather than continuing to stand exposed to the afternoon sun and the curious glances of other shoppers. Maricela, cautious but increasingly reassured by the genuine attention in Julian's questions, explained her circumstances in careful, embarrassed detail. The absent father, the exhausted unemployment system, the part-time job that fell short every single month by a margin that felt, to her, both small and insurmountable. Julian listened, and as she spoke, he found himself sharing, hesitantly at first, and then with growing openness, fragments of his own mother's history. The months of similar desperation she had once navigated, the exact phrase she had used, the particular courage it had required for a proud, private woman to approach strangers asking for help feeding her child. He told Maricela that hearing her say those specific words had struck him with a force he could not fully explain, as though some part of him had been waiting decades to finally be able to help the version of his mother he had been too young, at the time, to help himself. Before we go further, we want to acknowledge the person who had shaped Julian's capacity to respond with such immediate, genuine compassion. That afternoon, someone who was not present in that parking lot, but whose influence saturated the entire encounter completely. Esperanza, Julian's mother, had eventually recovered from those desperate months of his early childhood through the kindness of a single stranger, a grocery store manager who had quietly begun setting aside slightly expired, but still safe formula and baby food for her, rather than discarding it, an arrangement that had lasted nearly a year until Esperanza secured stable employment, an act of quiet generosity Julian had grown up hearing about repeatedly throughout his childhood. His mother determined that he understand exactly how much a single person's willingness to help had once changed the entire trajectory of their family's survival. Julian, sitting on that parking lot bench with a young mother he had known for less than 20 minutes, made a decision in that moment that he would later describe as feeling less like a choice and more like an inevitability, some debt of gratitude toward his own mother's memory finally finding somewhere concrete to be repaid. He walked with Maricela back into the grocery store, purchased not just the single container of formula she had originally hoped for, but enough supplies to fill her cart substantially: diapers, baby food, basic groceries for herself, brushing aside her embarrassed attempts to limit what he was buying. What followed over the subsequent weeks was, again, never framed by Julian as simple charity, and Maricela, proud and cautious after months of navigating a system that had often made her feel more like a burden than a person deserving of support, would not have accepted it had it been framed that way. Julian, drawing on his considerable professional network, helped Maricela secure an interview for an administrative position at his own company, one that offered not just significantly better pay than her laundromat job, but genuine benefits, including childcare assistance that would allow her to work without the constant, exhausting calculation of whether her income could possibly cover both formula and daycare in any given month. Maricela's transition into her new role was not without its own adjustments, the particular difficulty of learning new professional systems while still managing the demanding, sleep-deprived reality of caring for an infant largely alone. A colleague in the administrative department, a woman named Priscilla who had worked at Julian's company for several years, took Maricela under her wing during those early months, patient with the learning curve in a way that reflected the same quiet generosity Julian himself had modeled throughout the growing relationship. Julian visited Maricela and Rosalind periodically over the following months, never overstepping into anything that felt intrusive, but consistently present in a way that gradually built genuine trust between them. He often brought small gifts for Rosalind, toys and books, But more meaningfully, he began sharing, in fuller detail during these visits, the complete story of his mother's own difficult months decades earlier, details Maricela found herself deeply moved by, understanding increasingly that the compassion she had received was rooted not in pity, but in Julian's genuine recognition of his own family's history reflected back at him through her circumstances. Esperanza, Julian's mother, now in her 70s and still sharp despite some of the physical limitations that had come with age, insisted on meeting Maricela once Julian described the full circumstances of their encounter. The meeting, when it happened, was deeply emotional for all involved, Esperanza holding Maricela's hands and telling her, with the particular authority of someone who had once occupied nearly identical circumstances herself, that she understood completely the specific mixture of pride and desperation that had brought her to that parking lot, and that she was profoundly grateful her own long-ago struggle had somehow, through her son, found its way toward helping someone else navigate the exact same difficult path. 2 years passed. Maricela, now 25, had advanced within Julian's company to a position of genuine responsibility, her natural organizational skills and work ethic, once given a stable enough foundation to actually flourish, proving considerably more substantial than her previous circumstances had ever allowed her the opportunity to demonstrate. Rosalind, now 2.5, attended a quality daycare program near Maricela's new apartment, an apartment considerably more stable and comfortable than the precarious housing situation she had navigated during the hardest months following Rosalind's father's departure. Julian remained a consistent presence in their lives, having grown, over the 2 years since that parking lot encounter, into something resembling an honorary uncle figure for Rosalind and a genuine friend and mentor for Maricela, a relationship built not on the dramatic circumstances of their first meeting, but on the ordinary patient work of actually showing up consistently over time. He often told colleagues when the story came up in conversation that meeting Maricela had given him an unexpected opportunity to finally, fully honor the specific courage his own mother had once shown during the hardest months of his childhood, courage he had been too young, at the time, to properly recognize or repay. On Rosalind's 3rd birthday, Julian attended the small celebration Maricela organized, bringing along Esperanza, who had by then become something of an honorary grandmother figure in Rosalind's life, the two families having grown close in ways neither Julian nor Maricela could have anticipated on that difficult afternoon 2 years earlier. Esperanza, watching her granddaughter, in every meaningful sense but blood, blow out 3 candles surrounded by people who genuinely loved her, told Maricela quietly that she considered this particular friendship one of the most meaningful developments of her own long life, a full circle she had never expected to witness so directly. Maricela, reflecting during a quiet conversation with Julian later that same evening, told him that she had spent months before that parking lot encounter believing that asking for help meant she had somehow failed as a mother, a belief her own pride had made nearly unbearable to overcome even in her most desperate moments. She said that Julian's willingness to freeze, to genuinely listen rather than simply offer the polite, distracted sympathy most strangers provided, had taught her that vulnerability, however painful to display, could sometimes become the exact doorway through which genuine, life-changing help finally arrived. In the weeks following that first parking lot encounter, Julian found himself reflecting more deeply on his mother's history than he had in years, prompting several long, emotional conversations between them about a period of their family's life that Esperanza had rarely discussed in full detail, understandably reluctant to revisit the particular vulnerability of those desperate months. She told him during one of these conversations that the grocery store manager who had quietly helped her, a man named Harold who had passed away nearly a decade earlier, had never once made her feel like a burden or an object of pity, always framing his assistance simply as setting aside items that would otherwise go to waste. A small kindness of language that had allowed her to accept the help without the full weight of shame she might have otherwise carried. Julian recognized, listening to this detail, that he had unconsciously modeled his own approach to helping Maricela on that same principle, framing his assistance not as charity extended downward, but as opportunity and connection offered between equals, an approach that had allowed Maricela to accept his help with considerably less of the shame she might have otherwise felt, navigating such a sudden, significant change in her circumstances. Priscilla, the colleague who had mentored Maricela through her early months at the company, eventually became one of her closest friends, the two women developing a bond that extended well beyond their professional relationship, Priscilla often accompanying Maricela and Rosalind on weekend outings, becoming something of an honorary aunt figure in the child's life. She later told colleagues that watching Maricela's transformation over those 2 years, from an exhausted, isolated young mother barely holding her circumstances together to a confident, capable professional building genuine stability for her daughter, had been one of the most rewarding things she had witnessed in her own career. Maricela's own mother, who lived several states away and had been unable to offer much practical support during the hardest months following Rosalind's father's departure, visited more frequently once Maricela's circumstances stabilized, the two women's relationship gradually healing from some of the strain that financial desperation had placed on it during the previous difficult year. She met Julian and Esperanza during one of these visits, and the four adults, connected now by circumstances none of them could have predicted, developed an easy, warm rapport that further solidified the sense of extended family that had grown around Maricela and Rosalind in the 2 years since that parking lot encounter. Rosalind's father, notified indirectly through mutual acquaintances of Maricela's improved circumstances, made several attempts to reconnect during this period, attempts Maricela navigated carefully with the guidance of a family law attorney Julian's company connected her with as part of her employee benefits, ensuring that any future involvement from him would be structured in a way that prioritized Rosalind's stability and well-being above all else, rather than allowing renewed contact to destabilize the hard-won security Maricela had finally established for her daughter. On the second anniversary of that first parking lot encounter, Julian's company, at his quiet encouragement, established a modest internal fund specifically designed to help employees facing sudden financial emergencies, an initiative he named simply the Esperanza Fund, honoring his mother without ever needing to explain the specific personal history behind it to colleagues who nonetheless understood through the company's informal grapevine that it carried real meaning for their founder. Maricela, once she learned the fund's namesake, found herself deeply moved, understanding that the compassion she had received had already begun rippling outward to help other struggling employees who might never fully know the specific story behind the resource now available to them. Rosalind, though too young during those early years to remember the specific circumstances that had brought Julian and Esperanza into her life, grew up understanding, through the stories Maricela told her as she got older, that her family had been built partly through her mother's courage in a difficult moment and partly through a stranger's willingness to truly listen. A lesson Maricela hoped would shape how her daughter approached both her own struggles and other people's in the years ahead. On Rosalind's 5th birthday, Maricela began a small tradition of donating formula and diapers to the same food pantry that had once sustained them during the hardest months, ensuring that other struggling families in similar circumstances would have one less barrier standing between them and the help they needed. Julian, reflecting years later on the entire sequence of events that had begun with a single frozen moment in a parking lot, often told the story to new employees during onboarding sessions, not as a formal company anecdote, but as a genuine explanation of why he had built his organization's culture around the belief that struggling people deserve to be met with curiosity and respect rather than dismissal. He said that his own mother's courage, decades earlier, and Maricela's identical courage in a moment neither woman could have known would echo so precisely across generations, had taught him that the specific words a person chooses in their most desperate moment often carry an entire history behind them, one worth pausing long enough to actually hear. Esperanza, in the final years of her life, often spoke about that afternoon in the parking lot as one of the most meaningful moments of her son's adult life, telling family friends that watching Julian extend to a stranger the exact kindness she herself had once desperately needed felt like witnessing her own difficult history transform, finally, into something entirely good. When she passed away peacefully several years later, surrounded by family that now included Maricela and Rosalind as genuinely as any blood relative, Julian included in his eulogy the story of Harold, the grocery store manager who had quietly helped his mother decades earlier, noting that kindness, once given, has a way of traveling forward through time in ways the original giver could never fully anticipate, eventually finding its way to exactly the person who most needs it, in whatever form the moment requires. Maricela, standing beside Julian at Esperanza's memorial service, found herself reflecting on how completely unrecognizable her life had become since that desperate afternoon in the parking lot, no longer defined by the exhausting calculation of formula versus rent, but by genuine stability, meaningful work, and an extended family she had never expected to gain from a moment of such profound vulnerability. She told Julian afterward that she intended to teach Rosalind, as she grew older, the full story of Esperanza's courage decades earlier and her own identical courage years later, wanting her daughter to understand that the family they had built together had its roots not in convenient circumstance, but in the specific, replicated bravery of two women, generations apart, who had each found the strength to say the words out loud when they needed help most. On what would have been Esperanza's 80th birthday, nearly a year after her passing, the family gathered once more, Julian, Maricela, Rosalind, and Priscilla among them, to plant a small tree in her memory outside the grocery store parking lot where the entire story had begun. A quiet, private ceremony marking the exact spot where a stranger's frozen recognition had once transformed two families' futures. Julian spoke briefly, saying that his mother had spent much of her life believing her most desperate months represented something shameful to be hidden away, and that he hoped this small memorial, planted in the very place where her legacy had ultimately found its way toward helping someone else, would stand instead as a quiet testament to exactly how much good could grow from even the hardest chapters of a person's life. Priscilla, standing with the family at that quiet memorial, reflected that she had joined the small gathering not merely out of professional loyalty to Julian, but out of genuine personal investment in a story that had, over the years, taught her something important about the way patience and consistent presence could transform an initially professional relationship into something resembling genuine family. She had watched over the years as Maricela grew from an exhausted, uncertain new hire into a confident colleague and friend, and she considered herself fortunate to have witnessed the full arc of that transformation firsthand. Theodore, one of Julian's longtime friends, who had known him since before the founding of his company, often remarked that he had watched Julian change subtly but genuinely in the years following that parking lot encounter, describing him as someone who had always been generous in a professional, transactional sense, but who seemed, after meeting Maricela, to have discovered a deeper, more personal register of compassion that reshaped how he approached both his business and his family relationships going forward. Never underestimate the courage it takes for a proud person to ask for help in their most desperate moment. Never assume that a stranger's frozen reaction signals judgment rather than recognition. Never dismiss the possibility that your own history of hardship might be exactly what equips you to recognize and respond to someone else's struggle with genuine, immediate compassion. And never forget that sometimes the debt we carry toward the people who once helped our own families survive can only be properly repaid by extending that same help forward, to a stranger we never expected to meet, in circumstances neither of us could have predicted. If this story moved you, please like this video, leave a comment about the part that stayed with you longest, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that asking for help is never a failure, and that sometimes the person who stops to truly listen carries more understanding than you could ever know. Subscribe for more stories about resilience, unexpected compassion, and the quiet ways our own histories shape how we show up for others. Because sometimes the most important moment in a stranger's life begins with the simple, terrifying courage it takes to finally say the words out loud.